All right, let's talk about variables. In programming, we use variables to temporarily store data in the computer's memory. Now, technically, a variable is the name of a location in memory where we can store some value. Now, because the value can change, we refer to this location as a variable. Now, to declare a variable in C++, first we have to specify the type of data we want to store. Let's say int or integer for storing whole numbers. Then we give our variable a proper, meaningful name, like file size. Now, there are various ways to name our variables. We have various conventions. We'll talk about them momentarily. Once we declare a variable, then we terminate this statement with a semicolon. Now, I want to emphasize that you should always use meaningful names for your variables. Don't use abbreviations like FS, because someone else reading this code may not know what FS is short for. Also, don't go for names like F1 or F2 or thing. These are all cryptic and ambiguous, okay? So we're going to call this file size. And then we can give it a value like 100. So we assign it the value of 100. Now here we can combine these two statements into a single statement, and that makes our code shorter and more concise. So right here, where we declare our variable, we can give it an initial value of 100. This is called initializing a variable. Now we don't need the second line, okay? Now let's declare another variable for storing numbers with a decimal point. For that, we're going to use a different data type that is double. We're going to talk about different data types in the next section. So in this section, we're only going to work with integers and doubles. Now we're going to call this sales and initialize it to 9.99. Okay? Now that we have two variables, we can print them on the console. So instead of hello world, let's print file size. Run our program. We see 100. Beautiful. Now, while initializing variables is not mandatory, it's a good practice to follow. Let's see what happens if we don't initialize file size and print it on the terminal. Well, immediately we see this warning. Let's take a look. The warning is saying variable file size is uninitialized when used here. Initialize local variable file size. So our IDE is complaining that we are using a variable that doesn't have an initial value. Let's run our program and see what happens. Take a look. Look, we get this random value, and if we run our program multiple times, we see a completely different value. This is what we call garbage. This is the data that is currently in memory. So, as a best practice, we should always initialize our variables before using them. So I'm going to set this to an initial value of 0. Now, in languages like C# or Java, we don't have to do this. If we declare an integer, it automatically gets initialized to 0. But this is not how it works in C++, okay? So this is how we can declare and initialize variables. And by the way, we can also initialize multiple variables on the same line. So over here, we can declare a second integer. Let's call that counter. So we add a comma and then declare counter, and optionally, we can initialize it to some value. Now, while this works, it's often discouraged. As a best practice, we should declare each variable on a separate line. So I'm going to remove this and declare another integer like this. Okay? Now I have a small exercise for you. I want you to write code to swap the value of two variables. This is a common interview question, so let me explain what I mean. We're going to declare two variables, A and B. Now if we print A, we're going to see 1 on the terminal, right? Now here's what I want you to do. Over here, I want you to write code to swap the value of these variables. So when we print A, we see 2, and when we print B, we see 1. Now, I don't want you to reset these variables, so I don't want you to set A to 2 and B to 1. This is not the right solution. Let me give you a hint. Imagine instead of these two variables, we have two buckets. The first bucket is filled with apples. The second bucket is filled with oranges. Now, if we have these two buckets in real life, how can we swap their content? Think of a solution and then use that idea to write code to swap the value of these variables. It's not that difficult. Just spend a couple minutes on this and then come back see my solution. So to solve this problem in real life, we need a third bucket. First, we empty our apples bucket into this bucket. Now the apples bucket is empty, so we can move the content of the oranges bucket here. Now the oranges bucket is empty, so we can move the content of the third bucket into this bucket. Now we have swapped the content of our buckets, right? So let's use this idea to solve this exercise. We declare a third variable, we can call that temp, and we initialize it with what we have in A, that is the value of 1. Now we can set A to B, so whatever we have in B, which is 2, is now going to be in A. And finally, we're going to set B to temp, so B is going to be 1. So now, if we print A, we're going to see 2 instead of 1. Let's verify this. So let's run our program. There you go. Beautiful. So this was your first programming problem. If you got stuck, don't worry. It's completely normal. As we go through the course, I'm going to give you more and more exercises to help you build your confidence. Next, we're going to talk about constants.